Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of What's Next with We. This episode is part of the SaaS series. We have a special guest today. We have Aayush Choudhury. He's the founder of Scrut Automation, a very interesting tool in the GRC space. Obviously, we'll get to know more about it in this podcast. Ayush, welcome to What's Next with We.
Thanks, Raj. Good to be
Great.
here.
Great, Ayush. Same likewise. I'm Vishal, the V in What's Next with We, your host as always. Ayush, jumping right in, I'm sure the listeners would want to know your story. I think you're the quintessential IIT and obviously from a premium B school. Then did the corporate grind, worked at McKinsey, worked at a startup, and then started off. So I think it's a pretty interesting story. Listeners out there would also kind of relate to what you have gone through. So it would be great to know your story till you became founder at Scratch.
Sure, Vishal. The idea behind Scrut automation essentially comes from a pain point that the current founders face, but none of us, except for Kush, and we'll talk more about the backgrounds of the founders, but Kush is the only hardcore InfoSec person who's been in the space for the last 15 odd years. But essentially, I've been a supply chain guy for the longest time. I used to work with BPCL right after my undergrad, went to ISP, after which I joined McKinsey and worked with McKinsey for about 3.5 years, most of which was essentially working on operations and supply chain topics across manufacturing, pharma, chemicals kind of companies. And then after McKinsey, I joined a very early stage company called Pando, which was again in the freight management space. And when I left Pando first and I started out on my own, so Jayesh and I, two of the co-founders, we were working on an enterprise SaaS platform that helped manufacturing companies, very large manufacturing companies, manage the inbound material procurement. So pretty much most of my professional life prior to Scrut was about supply chain and procurement and operations and logistics, right? So, but the idea behind Scrut essentially came when Jayesh and I were working on our previous idea, which was the enterprise SaaS platform for procurement. And in a span of about 8 to 9 months that we were working on that idea, we did a bunch of enterprise pilots with some very large pharma companies, very large manufacturing companies. And while we're not continuing to work on that idea anymore, in that journey of 8 to 9 months, because we were working with a lot of large enterprises, because we were privy to their sensitive data, we were actually asked to communicate a very strong information security posture, which means we had to, even as a company that had less than 5 employees at that point of time, we had to, and the founders included, we had to manage compliance towards ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR, 27017, CSA star, and that really put a lot of pressure on us. That guzzled up a lot of our bandwidth. We were pretty clueless on how to handle that, but it seemed like a necessity. And that's when we met Kush, who's a third founder, who's the InfoSec expert. He's been a consultant in the space for very long. He was helping us manage our compliance towards those 5 standards. And somewhere along the journey, we realized that, well, this is an idea that we didn't want to continue working on for long. But in the course of doing that, we realized that this is probably a problem across the board. A lot of SaaS companies, fintech companies are facing similar problems. And that's when we went out in the market, spoke to some 200 plus companies out there, validated the problem, and launched the MVP sometime around November of 2021. So that's essentially been the journey. Something that so we were pretty much outsiders to the InfoSec space before Coach joined us and we started working on this. But it came from a very deep pain point that we faced. It's becoming an impediment for business. So yeah, that's how we came across this.
Quite interesting, Ayush. I think you figured out the problem statement while you were doing a startup. So that is pretty interesting. You mentioned SaaS quite a few times in your story. So segueing to my next question, obviously we are all been reading that India is a hub for SaaS. There's talent, there's market, and there's enough appetite globally to consume SaaS. So just wanted to understand your thoughts on India being the next SaaS hub. And people are saying it's going to be a $1 trillion economy by itself in India. So it would be great to hear your thoughts there.
So I think the advantage that SaaS founders in India have is that the nature of the problem itself is pretty global. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's true for us. It's true for our peers. Because you're solving a problem through a product. And while there is a strong customer success component involved as well, but Indian customer success folks are pretty conversant in English. Right? Now, given that context, I think what really helps a lot of SaaS founders in India is I think that's a strength that's hard to replicate, that's hard to teach. But culturally, we've grown in an environment that makes us very cutthroat and makes us very shameless to begin with. And that shamelessness is something that makes us very audacious in the way we're thinking about our product and our launches, right? I have spoken to a bunch of peers. We did that too, in some sense, where companies get launched even before the product is made. We're very happy to be wrong. We're very happy to go into the market with a product which has limited functionalities but is solving the core problem, right? And what that allows us to do is to uh, think about the product in a very lean, constrained manner, where we're actually getting to the root of the problem and figuring out what really matters to the customers, the one or two things that the customer is really willing to pay for. And I think that audacity is something that has helped a lot of, and we've been speaking to a lot of founders. There have been times when we felt lost. We felt intimidated by existing competition from our, US players who've been adequately funded as well. But I think that audacity, that comfort with working under constraints, that comfort with not really waiting for 100% of the answer to be available before actually taking the punt and going out there and selling, right? Those instincts, I think, is something that I've seen across SaaS founders in India, across the board, and that is what I think helps a lot of Indian SaaS founders do well. And so we are super duper optimistic about a lot of Indian SaaS founders making it big over the next decade or so.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Ayush. I've been also speaking to a bunch of SaaS founders, and I keep getting this vibes across. I think you mentioned very interesting insights there, that Indian founders have that audacity, have that uh, innovative mindset, I would say, right? Going to the core, building maybe it could be a scrappy product initially, show it to your customers, get feedback, ready for taking those critical feedback from customers, going back to the drawing board, and again building it out and showing it going back. So I think now you're seeing a lot of these founders doing that at scale in India. So I'm also with you, Ayush. I mean, I've been speaking and we see that trend happening. I hope at some day we become a $1 trillion economy by itself, sitting down in India.
Also, if you look at the external environment, I think our parents, our seniors, our peers are a lot more comfortable with the idea of us trying something big and failing
True.
than probably they were a decade ago. I mean, failure is
Correct.
very normal now. It's taken in the right spirit. Given the fact that there is, a lot of startups have come up in the last decade. There's money in
Right.
the ecosystem, so there are strong plan Bs if people fail. So people are not afraid of taking the punt. Uh,
True.
and I think these have been good enablers in the ecosystem.
True, Ayush. And I think one thing that you mentioned, one is from the ecosystem point of view, your parents, your ecosystem is supporting you. They don't
Yes.
have any inhibitions in folks leaving like a large corporate and going into a startup and kind of spending 2, 3 years to figure it out. Another interesting trend is there are founders right there in college, in bachelor's, in the second, third year building products. And obviously you have a lot of enablers, the government, education institutions, helping you build those products right in college, right? You're seeing so many founders starting it out, and by the time they graduate, they're already being funded. So good foundation for India to kind of be the big player in the SaaS space. I just want to now go into the next bit. Obviously, you touched upon Scrut. You found this big pain point in your previous startup, which was again SaaS. So would be great to understand more about Scrut. I did go through your website, but it was a little bit complicated. So if you can break it down for the listeners, would be great. What is Scrut first, and some use cases that you're really solving for SaaS, other SaaS companies and mid-size companies. That would be great to hear.
Sure. So at the outset, Scrut is essentially a platform that helps SaaS, fintech, and healthcare companies, essentially cloud native companies, to manage their information security posture and their compliance better. Right? And when I say better, it means faster and with significantly lower manual effort involved. Now, what that means is that the genesis of the problem is that uh, most of the SaaS companies, health tech companies, fintech companies today are actually aiming big. They're being very audacious in terms of the logos they target. Many of them are significantly punching above their weight and targeting very big customers. And uh, large enterprises have also been very open in the past several years in working with younger SaaS companies, with challenger SaaS companies, with younger alternatives to legacy systems out there.
True.
But what that has also meant is that these large enterprises expect the younger SaaS companies to walk half the distance and communicate a very strong information security posture, right? And the way this is manifested, because they would be trusting them with their critical data, and the way this is manifested essentially is that uh, younger companies now have to comply with standards and laws, the likes of an ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, and now there's PDPA for Singapore as well. So practically every country has their own privacy laws now.
True.
And managing that can sometimes become a big overhead because there are a bunch of policies involved, bunch of evidence tasks involved, there are internal and external audits involved, there are external resources involved like pen testers and auditors. And then there is a continuous observability around monitoring a cloud infra. And as companies graduate from being smaller companies to slightly more mid-market companies, their cloud assets become many in number. It becomes more complicated to monitor what those assets are, how are they configured, and what are the relationships between them, and consequently, what are the risks that they are essentially exposed to within the environment. So this is the part that Scrut essentially automates, and it reduces about 60-70% of the effort involved in getting compliant with these standards quickly, and B, continuously monitoring your posture towards these, right? So that you don't have to manually carry out internal audits every time. The platform will do it on your behalf, and you will need to only worry about the 10 or 12 things that are exposing you to certain form of risk, and you need to fix those, right? So that essentially becomes a massive enabler in the sales process, because for these companies that are selling to enterprises or selling in certain geographies, you can build trust right from day one of the sales process. You don't have to wait for your customers to carry out an internal audit, send a long information security questionnaire. You can actually start building trust from day one of the sales process without actually having to put a lot of manual effort behind this. So that's the idea of Scrut.
Understood, Ash. I think pretty interesting tool that you mentioned, automation, obviously automation at scale. And this typically helps startups who are looking at large enterprises globally to be, as you said, compliant on day one. I just wanted to check with you on, in terms of time with Scrut, without Scrut, how much time would enterprises or startups or mid-sized companies save? Have you done that analysis?
So there are three parts to this. There are three parts to managing an information security posture and your compliance towards specific standards. The first part is essentially identifying what is wrong. When you're doing it for the first time, identifying what is wrong in an environment, what risks are you exposed to, right? That's essentially the gap assessment and risk assessment part of it. The second part is actually remediating them for the first time. And the third part is monitoring that on an ongoing basis. Right? So the first and the third part is essentially where Scrut would save about 70-80% of the manual effort involved.
Wow.
The middle part where there's actual remediation involved, which is something that customers have to still go through that journey, fix a bunch of stuff, make changes to the code if necessary, do a bunch of configurations. Right? But the first and third part is typically what is done in a very manual fashion. So that's a traditional way of doing it. And it's hard for you to manage a continuous information security posture. So this is where Scrut would essentially reduce about 70 to 80% of your time. So so for example, when you're getting compliant for the first time, you could potentially take several months, 3 to 4 months to manage all of that, carry out a detailed, comprehensive gap assessment / risk assessment, and then begin the compliance activity. That 3 to 4 months can be shrunk to 2 weeks if you're doing it in an automated manner. So that's the order of a difference that having GRC automation can create for you.
Got it. Hey, Aayush, good to see such tools coming in the market, because you typically don't find too many GRC tools out there, right? Helping you save time, cost, resources, because most of the times I'm sure companies would hire external consultants to do this. I think you save quite a bit in terms of time, resources, money as well. So, segue into my next question. I'm sure obviously this compliance, data security, and obviously the cloud infra, as you said, to monitor that on a continuous basis. I'm sure this will keep continuing. This problem will still exist going into the future. What do you think is, coming to my theme of my podcast, what's next in this space in terms of how the problem would evolve? How will your solution evolve? If you can maybe share some thoughts on this, would be great. As you also mentioned, each country have their own compliance to take care of. Do you think at some point in time there'll be a single compliance globally? Would each maybe country have a individual one? Just wanted to get your thoughts, basically crystal balling into the future. So would be good to hear your thoughts here.
I think what has happened in this space is that over the last several years, companies as well as governments, local bodies have gotten very conscious about information security compliance, because the attackers have become smarter, the frequency of breaches and the intensity of the breaches has increased a lot. So now two things have happened here. One thing is that the standards that you hear of now, you have 5x the number of standards. Every company has its own privacy laws, as you pointed out. So I don't see consolidation or unification happening in this space. Every country is probably going to have their own privacy laws. The standards are probably going to get more comprehensive. They'll get updated every now and then. They'll live up to the times. But yeah, I mean, the standards in terms of the number of standards you need to manage, that's not going to reduce. It's probably going to increase, right? And what that has created is a bit of so we see a lot of our users getting overwhelmed with the number of standards that they need to comply with. There's a lot of acronym fatigue out there.
Yeah.
And what has also happened is that in the security space, a lot of solutions have come up. If you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant, right? So there's and the hype cycles. So there are so many acronyms out there, so many different point solutions. And I don't want to start naming them down here, but it's also easy to get for a CTO of a SaaS company. It's very easy now to get overwhelmed by the kind of tools that are out there, and there's a lot of tool fatigue and acronym fatigue there as well, right? So what is it that's most applicable to you? And we see several situations where companies they've used a separate cloud protection tool, a separate AppSec tool, a separate privacy ops tool, a separate GRC GRC tool. And these are enterprise grade tools that they're using as point solutions and probably just using 20-25% of their capabilities because they just don't know what makes most amount of sense for them. There's so much of tool fatigue out there. So I think these two are the trends that we find most interesting. And this is what we are very consciously trying to counter, right? What that means is that because you could have a gazillion standards out there, but the essential information security controls pretty much remain the same. The basics remain the same. The standards vary from each other very incrementally. The core remains the same, right? So the approach that we've taken is to have a risk-first approach where we say that, look, given your environment, given your infra, these are the risks that you are exposed to. And that is something that the platform fetches automatically through a bunch of its integrations. And once those risks are identified, we help you establish controls that mitigate those risks, right? And that approach helps you because then your environment you're actually securing your environment. You're not maintaining a separate checklist for your risk and a separate checklist for your controls. And once you establish those controls, some of those controls will inevitably make you compliant with multiple standards. And if there's a control, for example, an access control policy, that will get mapped to an ISO 27001, that will get mapped to a SOC 2, that will get mapped to an NIST 800. So you wouldn't have to duplicate that effort. So we're taking a risk-first approach. Then we're making your controls talk to your risks so that once we do the mapping in the backend, you don't have to worry too much about, even if you have to comply with 6 or 7 different standards, you only have to worry about those 10 or 12 controls or 50 controls that are most essential for you. The mapping will happen, right? At the time of the audit, just open the relevant standard and it's fine. So don't get overwhelmed by the different acronyms out there. So that's what we sort of try to evangelize very, very aggressively. That's what we try to keep telling our customers. That's the kind of panic that we want to remove very consciously, right? Through the content we put out there, through our multiple conversations, through our participations in various forums. Then the second part around tool fatigue, the kind of customers that we are looking for, that we are most bullish about are essentially customers that have an environment that's reasonably complex, that need information security beyond just a compliance checklist, but they're also not very large enterprises, and therefore they don't have the luxury of managing a very large infosec team, right? And this is a segment that has been traditionally a little underpenetrated, a little underserved, because large enterprises have the right amount of, even if they don't have the tools, they have enough people to manage infosec companies, right?
Correct.
But this middle market group, and you see a lot of CISOs coming up in this mid-market segment. So that's a segment where we are very consciously trying to reduce the tool fatigue that I spoke about. So don't have to manage 20 different point solutions. Let's have just one solution, Scrut or otherwise, which essentially helps you, get a single window observability of where your risks are. And forget about the different acronyms, forget about the various tools. Just worry about those risks, because that is what is going to create problems in an environment, right? And define controls that talk to those risks. So that's the other fatigue, or the other friction that we're essentially trying to remove, because we believe that mid-market SaaS, fintech, and health tech CISO shouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about different acronyms, worrying about different tool categories, but they should only be focused on the risks that they're exposed to and the controls that mitigate those risks. So these are two developments that have happened over the last few years. And I think if we are at least one of the people that, that help remove that friction, remove that fatigue, prevent our target group CISOs and CTOs from being overwhelmed, I think we'd consider ourselves successful there.
Okay, thanks, Ayush. I think laid down very in a nice way because I also am learning this space. So thanks for breaking it down for our listeners. So listeners out there, founders, CISOs, CTOs, if you want to kind of look at an interesting GRC tool to remove the jargons, make it super simple, you know whom to reach. Ayush, thanks for that once again to break it down. Before we leave, maybe my last question uh, would be couple of points for future. As you mentioned, I think we touched upon the topic on India being the SaaS hub. Just some 2, 3 last uh, thoughts for future SaaS leaders from India. What would be the main 2, 3 things that they should look at? So it would be good to hear your final thoughts on this.
I think one thing that we very strongly believe in is that, and it's a little counterintuitive, but I think sometimes domain expertise does more harm than good in some situations, right? And there needs to be a certain balance within the team. Of course, expertise has its own value. There are multiple ways to get that expertise. You can have advisors, you can have people you can trust, but lack of domain expertise in a particular field, we very strongly feel should not intimidate people willing to start up in that field, because oftentimes the advantage you have if you're not an expert in the field is that you really have no option but to really build your understanding bottom up. Talk to customers and figure out what is bothering them. Some of the best companies have been created by people who are outsiders to that field. I think that's something that we very strongly believe is because oftentimes, even if the founder has really faced the problem, it's very easy to get biased by their understanding of the solution. Is their attachment to the problem should be limited to the problem itself and not to the solution. So that's one thing that I would strongly suggest people to think about. And the second thing really is that, again, right? So I earlier in the conversation I mentioned a certain amount of shamelessness and audacity that Indian SaaS founders have, and we felt very inspired by that when we started out. I mean, they don't care a lot, right? It's easy. They start selling from day one, even if they don't have the product absolutely right, with the basic hygiene elements in place. They start selling. They never stop selling, and that's an instinct that I think is very important. All of us collectively should find a way to develop that instinct more, to institutionalize that within our own companies, to find a way to talk about it more, talk about it at very early stages. I mean, when people are in college, right? Because that is an instinct that I think sets us apart. We don't wait for perfection. We keep selling no matter what, right? I think that is something that is a disproportionate advantage that Indian SaaS founders have, and we should continue doing that.
Awesome, Mahesh. I think you mentioned 2 important points. One was not having that domain expertise. I think that's your story, right? I think you also went through that you understood this problem in your previous startup, figured out, okay, what could be the solution, and you kind of built your understanding from grounds up, where you didn't have much understanding before. So that was an actually interesting point. It's good to have a mix of folks in your founding team. I think you've got a good mix in your team. Second, I think as you mentioned, same shamelessness, right? I think that quality per se, typically, nothing offends you. If somebody comes back and saying, hey, the product sucks, or I think it needs a lot of improvement, we are okay with it. We're like, okay, we'll go back, we'll work with our team, build it from scratch and come back to you. So I've seen that. I've also worked in a couple of startups. I've seen that attitude. And I think, Ayush, that's good that you highlighted that. Ayush, on that note, great to have you. I think I've been following up for the past 1 month. Good to have you finally. Thanks for taking out time on a Sunday to be part of What's Next with Ayush. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure, Vishal. Thanks a lot.